The discussion the other week about 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico was a shocker, particularly for names like Honda and Toyota, which produce cars in both.
While America celebrated trade protection through 25% automotive tariffs, Japanese automakers quietly activated contingency plans written back in 2018. No panic, no press, just flawless execution. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan weren't caught off guard. They were ready for economic war. How do you move entire industries without anyone noticing? Why are production schedules being rewritten in Thailand instead of Tennessee? This isn't just competition, it's adaptation at the highest level. And ironically, U.S. trade policy is now accelerating the very Asian economic unity it hoped to block. Stay tuned. What's coming next changes everything about global auto power. The numbers behind the silence. Your next car payment just became a geopolitical weapon. The numbers behind the Japanese response reveal an automotive industry holding its breath, while $19 billion in profits hang in the balance. Toyota faces the biggest single hit, over $10 billion in potential annual impact. Despite producing more than 1.3 million vehicles in America annually, the company still imports roughly 38% of its United States sales. Every RAV4 shipped from Ontario, every Prius crossing from Japan now carries a 25% penalty. Honda's exposure runs $3 billion deep. Nearly 40% of Honda's 1.4 million annual American sales come from imports, with the compact cars that built the brand's reputation now priced out of reach for the very buyers who made Honda successful. Nissan's $3 billion exposure comes at the worst possible time. Already struggling with declining sales and the collapse of its planned Honda merger, the company now faces tariffs on 27% of its American sales. Every Japanese-built Rogue now costs dealers an additional $5,000. Mazda faces a devastating 59% reduction in operating profits if tariffs are fully passed to consumers. The company that carved out a niche with affordable vehicles suddenly finds its entire American strategy built on economics that no longer exist. These aren't just corporate problems, they're American family problems. The average car buyer now faces potential price increases of thousands of dollars on vehicles they thought they could afford. Dealers who built businesses on reliable Japanese inventory face months of uncertain supply. The consequences would ripple across continents, starting with a single factory shift that nobody saw coming. Masters of adaptation. When does corporate strategy become survival instinct? When the rulebook gets rewritten overnight, and the masters of long-term thinking discover their 40-year American investment is suddenly a liability. Japanese automotive companies don't operate like their American counterparts. There are no dramatic CEO press conferences, no public battles with government officials. Japanese corporate culture views public confrontation as failure. The art is in adapting so smoothly that disruption becomes competitive advantage. This approach was forged in the economic turbulence of the 1970s, when oil crises and trade tensions forced Japanese companies to become masters of efficiency and flexibility. While American automakers lobbied for protection, Japanese companies invested in American factories. The cultural philosophy is called Kaizen, continuous improvement through small, constant adjustments. But what Americans witnessed in April 2025 wasn't Kaizen. It was Kakushin, radical innovation born from necessity. Toyota's response embodied this philosophy perfectly. No angry statements about unfair treatment, no threats to leave American markets. Instead, quiet conversations with suppliers, gentle adjustments to production schedules, and strategic investments in American facilities that would reduce import dependence without appearing reactionary. Honda followed the same script. While American executives might have called emergency board meetings, Honda simply accelerated existing plans to shift Civic hybrid production from Mexico to Indiana. The tariffs simply moved the timeline from someday to immediately. Nissan demonstrated the same disciplined approach. Rather than dramatic factory closures or public complaints, the company quietly announced it would maximize production at its Tennessee facility while reducing Japanese output of American-bound vehicles. Where American companies might see crisis, Japanese companies saw opportunity. Where American executives might seek government intervention, Japanese strategists were already implementing solutions. Meanwhile, in manufacturing plants across 3 nations, machinery was already moving to execute plans that would reshape North American automotive production forever. We traced every production shift, battery partnership, and tariff impact across 3 countries, so you didn't have to. Now you've got the real story behind Toyota, Honda, and Nissan's silent relocation. If that saved you hours of digging, hit subscribe and share your take in the comments. The production pivot begins. The biggest industrial reorganization in automotive history started with a single memo. Honda's internal communication on April 5th contained just 3 sentences. Civic hybrid production shifts to Indiana effective immediately. Mexican facility transitions to alternate model production. Timeline 60 days. What followed was a masterclass in industrial choreography that most Americans would never see. While media focused on political implications, Honda engineers were performing supply chain surgery that would have taken most companies years to execute. The Civic hybrid represented everything Honda had built its reputation on: reliable, efficient, affordable transportation for middle-class families. Moving its production from Mexico to Indiana wasn't just a manufacturing decision. It was a declaration that Honda intended to remain competitive regardless of political headwinds. Toyota's response was equally decisive. The RAV4, America's best-selling vehicle in 2024, had become the foundation of Toyota's American success. Toyota quietly began evaluating Kentucky expansion that could handle next-generation RAV4 production domestically. Adding RAV4 production would require investments approaching $2 billion and hiring thousands of workers. Nissan's pivot was the most dramatic. The company announced it would max out production at its Smyrna, Tennessee facility, currently operating at roughly 70% capacity. The 6 million square foot plant would add third shifts, hybrid production capabilities, and potentially an Infinity luxury model, all designed to reduce dependence on imports while creating American jobs. But the real story was happening in supplier networks most consumers never think about. Honda's decision to source batteries from Toyota's American facilities rather than Asian suppliers demonstrated how tariffs were forcing competitors to become collaborators. The speed of these changes defied conventional wisdom about industrial adaptation. Traditional automotive wisdom suggested that major production shifts required 3 to 5 years of planning. Japanese companies were executing in months what American analysts thought impossible in years. Deep within the supply chain, the real transformation was just beginning, and it would touch every American who planned to buy a car in the next decade. Factories in motion. What if the biggest threat wasn't foreign competition, but domestic betrayal of integrated economics? While politicians celebrated protecting American jobs, the reality unfolding in factories across 3 nations revealed a transformation that would reshape automotive manufacturing forever. Nissan's Kyushu plant in southwest Japan became ground zero for industrial recalibration. The facility received new orders in early May, cut 13,000 Rogue SUV units over the next 3 months. Workers who had spent years perfecting assembly suddenly found themselves working reduced hours, with production halted on certain days. This wasn't panic, it was precision surgery. Nissan simultaneously announced it would maximize production at its Smyrna, Tennessee facility. The 6 million square foot complex, capable of producing 640,000 vehicles annually, had been operating at 70% capacity. Now it would run at maximum output. Honda's transformation was even more dramatic. The Marysville, Ohio facility underwent flexible line conversion, producing both gasoline vehicles and electric hybrids on the same assembly line without shutting down production. While most domestic brands require months-long shutdowns for such transitions, Honda executed the change during regular 2-week maintenance windows. The Civic hybrid production shift from Mexico to Indiana represented more than geographical relocation. Honda was demonstrating that Japanese manufacturing philosophy could adapt faster than American political cycles. Toyota's Kentucky operations expanded quietly but significantly. The Georgetown facility began preparations for RAV4 production that would reduce dependence on Canadian imports. The expansion required rebuilding supplier relationships and reconfiguring logistics networks optimized for cross-border efficiency. But the most revealing changes were happening in places most Americans never consider: the shipping schedules that connect factories to dealerships across the country. The Mexican factor. The middle class wasn't just squeezed. It was caught between 2 industrial giants, rewriting North America's automotive rules. Mexico, long the third pillar of North American vehicle production, saw its 40-year partnership with the U.S. suddenly unravel. Nissan's Aguascalientes plant, home of the Kicks, Versa, and Sentra, faced a no-win scenario: ship to the U.S. and eat a 25% tariff, or redirect output and abandon the American market. The impact was swift. Miguel Hernandez, a 20-year veteran at Aguascalientes, watched predictable production schedules become chaos. Orders from American dealers no longer arrived reliably. Honda's Celaya facility, which built over 150,000 HRVs for the U.S. in 2024, faced similar turmoil. The plant was designed specifically for U.S. market needs. There was no plan B. Those features didn't match global preferences. For Mexican workers trained in Japanese manufacturing methods, the shock was personal. Their jobs weren't gone, but the certainty that had defined their lives disappeared. Local suppliers, having invested millions in U.S.-oriented tooling, now faced obsolescence. Small towns built around automotive jobs saw their economic heart sputter. Adding to the sting was timing. Mexico's auto output had hit record highs in 2024, with some plants outperforming counterparts abroad. The crisis wasn't about quality, it was about geopolitics. And the real loss wasn't just in profits, it was in decades of seamless continental cooperation. Supply chain surgery. How does an industry evolve under threat? Slowly, piece by piece, one supplier at a time. Sourcing changes that once took years were now happening in days. Honda's battery shift to Toyota's U.S. facilities wasn't convenience, it was survival strategy. Former rivals became reluctant partners, forced to cooperate just to keep factories running. It wasn't just final assembly that was hit. Every bolt, circuit, and hose crossing a border now came with a new cost. A 25% tariff on parts began in May, compounding the problem. Even cars built in American factories weren't safe. Virtually all relied on imported parts. Total domestic production, in the true sense, was fantasy. Japanese automakers adapted with discipline. Honda began mapping every component path across borders, assessing risk at each stage. Toyota built resilience metrics into supplier evaluations, prioritizing geopolitical stability over raw cost. Nissan offered longer contracts and technical training to U.S. suppliers to reduce foreign reliance. The effort was immense, but illuminating. True independence was a myth, but resilience, that was possible if the industry could diversify faster than politics could destabilize it. The innovation acceleration. Innovation wasn't just the solution, it became the weapon of choice. In an economic war where technology advancement could circumvent political restrictions and create competitive advantages that tariffs couldn't touch, Toyota's solid-state battery development, originally planned for gradual introduction over the next decade, suddenly became a strategic priority with compressed timelines. The technology promised not just better performance, but domestic production that would eliminate dependence on imported battery cells. Nissan's compact electric vehicle program accelerated dramatically. The company realized that electric vehicles represented more than environmental responsibility. They offered supply chain independence. Electric drivetrains required fewer imported components than traditional gasoline engines. Honda's innovation response was perhaps the most sophisticated. The company began developing tariff-resistant vehicle designs, cars engineered specifically to minimize imported content while maintaining the quality and efficiency that Honda customers expected. The innovation acceleration extended beyond individual companies. Japanese automakers began sharing research and development costs for technologies that would benefit the entire industry's American competitiveness. Traditional corporate secrecy gave way to collaborative innovation, driven by shared political pressure. Research and development investment in American facilities increased dramatically. Toyota announced plans to expand its Michigan Technical Center. Honda accelerated hybrid technology development in Ohio. Nissan committed to electric vehicle research in Tennessee. The technology race wasn't just about better cars. It was about political survival. Companies that could innovate their way out of tariff vulnerability would thrive. Those that couldn't would find themselves gradually priced out of the American market they had spent decades cultivating. Now the entire industry hung in the balance of battery chemistry and political chemistry, and the next phase would determine which force proved stronger. The profit apocalypse. Your retirement savings? They just became collateral damage in an automotive war. The financial devastation spreading through Japanese automakers revealed how quickly 40 years of profitable relationships could transform into balanced balance sheet nightmares. Mazda faced the most brutal mathematics. Goldman Sachs analysts projected a 59% reduction in operating profits if tariffs were fully passed to consumers. The company that had carved out a profitable niche with engaging, affordable vehicles suddenly discovered its entire American business model built on economics that no longer existed. Nissan's projections were almost as devastating. A 56% operating profit decline that would compound the company's existing financial crisis. Already struggling with declining sales and credit downgrades to junk status, Nissan now faced tariffs on 27% of its American sales. Even Toyota, with its massive scale and diversified product lineup, couldn't escape the financial gravity. The world's largest automaker faced a 6% decline in operating profits, seemingly modest until translated into actual dollars. 6% of Toyota's profits represented more than $10 billion in lost earnings potential. Honda's 8% hit carried particular sting because it threatened the company's reputation for financial discipline. Suddenly, external political forces were undermining decades of operational excellence. The stock market response was swift and merciless. Nissan shares, already battered by merger collapse, lost additional value as investors calculated the company's ability to survive simultaneous operational and political pressure. Behind closed doors, merger discussions were collapsing in real time as the fundamental economics that made deals attractive evaporated under tariff pressure. The merger that wasn't the $60 billion salvation became a $60 billion casualty. The Honda-Nissan merger, announced with great fanfare in December 2024, disintegrated under the combined pressure of corporate pride and tariff-induced financial uncertainty. Honda executives, initially enthusiastic about creating the world's third-largest automaker, began questioning whether they wanted to inherit Nissan's tariff exposure, along with its operational challenges. The merger economics that looked attractive in December became impossible by April. Nissan's insistence on equal partnership status, despite its weaker financial position, clashed with Honda's practical assessment that any combined company would need decisive leadership to navigate tariff disruption. Honda's proposal to make Nissan a subsidiary triggered Nissan's corporate pride and ultimately killed the deal. Renault, Nissan's largest shareholder, opposed the merger terms, partly because tariffs had reduced Nissan's value below what Renault considered acceptable. The French automaker couldn't afford to see its Nissan investment diluted in a merger that might not survive political turbulence. The merger collapse left Nissan isolated at precisely the moment when scale and financial strength mattered most. While Honda could absorb tariff impacts through operational adjustments, Nissan faced the possibility of choosing between profitability and market share. Industry analysts noted the cruel timing. The merger had been designed to help both companies compete against Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers. Instead, American trade policy had created new challenges that made collaboration more difficult. What came next would test every alliance Japan had built in America, as financial pressure transformed corporate relationships and forced companies to choose between loyalty and survival. Consumer sticker shock. The car you ordered in January, it just became unaffordable by April. The arithmetic of tariffs created immediate financial pain for American families who discovered their transportation budgets had been conscripted into a trade war they never voted for. Honda dealers watched the Civic Hybrid, traditionally priced around $28,000, approach $35,000 as tariffs and supply chain disruptions compounded. The vehicle that had represented affordable reliability for middle-class families suddenly competed with luxury sedans on price. Toyota RAV. 4 buyers faced similar sticker shock. The SUV that became America's best-selling vehicle, partly because of its reasonable $30,000 starting price, now pushed toward $38,000. Families budgeting for reliable transportation found themselves priced into used car markets. Nissan's response revealed the impossible choices facing automakers. The company reduced pricing on some Mexican-built models, absorbing tariff costs to maintain market share. The Rogue and Pathfinder received price cuts between $640 and nearly $2,000. Nissan's attempt to keep vehicles affordable while sacrificing profitability. Dealers found themselves explaining price increases they couldn't control to customers who blamed them for costs they didn't create. Many dealers began cutting advertising budgets and holding off on new hires as they braced for reduced volume. The used car market responded predictably. Prices increased as buyers sought alternatives to new vehicles, suddenly priced beyond their reach. 3-year-old Civics and Corollas Corollas gained value as consumers realized reliable transportation had become more expensive regardless of age. Meanwhile, on the factory floor, workers were calculating their own futures as companies balanced employment costs against revenue pressures in an industry where profit margins had always been thin. The employment equation. When does job creation become job destruction? When the math stops working and companies face impossible choices between maintaining employment and maintaining solvency in markets where political decisions override economic logic. American automotive employment faced a complex calculation. While tariffs theoretically protected domestic jobs by making imports expensive, the reality proved more nuanced. Japanese companies employed hundreds of thousands of Americans directly, with millions more jobs dependent on their supplier networks. Nissan's Smyrna facility, despite plans to maximize production, faced uncertainty about which models would remain profitable to build. Workers who had spent careers building expertise in specific vehicle lines wondered whether their skills would remain relevant. Honda's employment picture brightened in some locations while darkening in others. The Indiana facility, gaining Civic hybrid production, would hire additional workers, but Honda's overall employment growth slowed as expansion plans requiring cross-border coordination were postponed. Mexican automotive workers bore the most immediate employment impact. Plants that had built their workforce around American market production faced reduced hours and uncertain futures. The integrated North American automotive workforce suddenly found itself divided by political borders. Supplier network employment faced complex challenges. Small manufacturers who had invested in equipment specifically for Japanese automaker requirements discovered their specialized knowledge might become obsolete if companies changed sourcing strategies. The consequences rippled beyond paychecks into entire communities built around automotive manufacturing. Towns in Tennessee, Ohio, Alabama, and Mississippi watched their primary economic engines recalculate their futures based on political decisions made in Washington. Alliance under pressure. How does a 70-year alliance fracture? One tariff at a time, one trust violation at a time, until the foundation of post-war cooperation crumbles under economic nationalism that forgot why partnerships mattered. The Japan-America alliance had survived the Cold War, 1980s trade tensions, and the 2008 financial crisis. Built on mutual defense and economic interdependence, the relationship created prosperity for both nations while maintaining Pacific stability. The automotive tariffs represented more than trade policy. They attacked the economic integration that made the alliance meaningful. Japanese automakers hadn't just invested money in America, they had invested trust. Factories in Tennessee, Ohio, and Alabama represented Japanese confidence in American partnership. That trust was now being weaponized against them. Japanese government officials struggled to respond to what they viewed as betrayal by their closest ally. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's public statements remained diplomatically correct, but private communications revealed deep frustration with American unpredictability. The timing was particularly damaging. As China expanded its military presence and North Korea continued developing nuclear capabilities, Japan and America needed closer cooperation, not economic warfare that undermined mutual confidence. Japanese business leaders began questioning whether American partnership offered the stability their long-term investments required. If political wins could eliminate 40 years of economic integration overnight, what other agreements might prove temporary? Across the Pacific, other nations were taking notes about what happened when you trusted American economic promises too completely. The Asian Response Network. What if the biggest winner wasn't American manufacturing, but Asian unity? The tariff crisis was creating exactly what American policymakers claimed to prevent: closer economic cooperation between Asian nations that reduced dependence on American markets. Southeast Asian countries moved quickly to capitalize on Japanese manufacturing displacement. Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia began aggressive campaigns to attract automotive investment from companies seeking politically stable production bases. Unlike America, where trade policy could change with elections, Southeast Asian nations offered long-term stability. Thailand's automotive sector, already producing over 2 million vehicles annually, positioned itself as the logical destination for production capacity leaving Mexico. The country offered Japanese companies familiar business relationships and government commitments that wouldn't change based on political campaigns. Vietnam's emergence as an automotive hub accelerated dramatically. Honda's existing motorcycle production provided foundation for expanded automotive operations, while Vietnam's trade agreements offered market access that purely domestic American production couldn't match. China watched the disruption with strategic interest. If America treated close allies as economic adversaries, what incentive did other Asian nations have to resist Chinese economic integration? Regional trade agreements that had been developing slowly suddenly gained urgency. Japanese investment flows began shifting toward Asian partnerships that offered greater political stability. The real battle wasn't about cars. It was about whether Asian nations would continue organizing their economies around American partnerships or develop alternatives that reduced dependence on unstable American policies. The technology transfer. Innovation doesn't respect borders, but investment does. The tariff crisis was accelerating technology development location decisions that would determine which countries controlled automotive innovation for the next generation. Japanese automakers began shifting research and development investment away from projects requiring cross-border coordination. Toyota's solid-state battery development, originally planned for eventual American production, accelerated toward Asian manufacturing that wouldn't face political interference. Electric vehicle technology became a strategic priority for location decisions. Honda's partnership with LG Energy Solution for American battery production represented the kind of international cooperation that tariffs undermined. Future partnerships would prioritize political stability over geographic convenience. Patent filing patterns revealed the strategic shift. Japanese companies began registering breakthrough technologies in Asian jurisdictions first, reversing previous practices that had prioritized American intellectual property protection. The brain drain was subtle but significant. Japanese engineers working on American projects began receiving offers from Asian operations where their work wouldn't face political interference. Technical expertise, once shared freely across the Pacific Alliance, became compartmentalized by national boundaries. Chinese technology companies recognized the opportunity. If Japanese automotive innovation was becoming politically complicated in America, Chinese partnerships offered alternative development paths without alliance baggage. Countries that maintained stable, predictable business environments would attract innovation investment. Those that weaponized economic relationships would find themselves excluded from collaborative development. That's when the 2030 implications became clear. The decisions made in 2025 were determining which nations would control automotive technology for the next decade. The long game. This wasn't just about who wins in 2025. It was about who's still standing in 2030. The automotive tariff crisis had revealed fundamental questions about American economic leadership that would reshape global commerce. Japanese companies were implementing America-independent strategies that reduced dependence on American markets and political stability. Toyota's global production network was being redesigned for Asian coordination, with American operations as just one market among many. Demographic trends made the strategic shift inevitable. American automotive market growth was slowing while Asian markets offered expansion potential that didn't exist in mature American markets. Tariffs simply accelerated strategic shifts that economic logic was already encouraging. Future automotive innovation would develop in countries that offered stable, long-term partnerships rather than unpredictable political interference. Electric vehicles, autonomous driving, and connected car technologies required sustained international cooperation that political volatility undermined. Japanese business culture, trained in long-term thinking, was already planning for scenarios where American partnerships became secondary to Asian cooperation. Companies that had spent decades integrating with American suppliers were quietly developing alternatives that reduced strategic vulnerability. So let me ask you this: can economic nationalism truly survive in a world driven by global tech innovation? Or are we just speeding up the very shift we're trying to stop? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching.